Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Maisris, Perek Aleph. Today, Halacha Aleph and Halacha Beis. We are learning Daf Gimel, and we left off on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, 4 lines from the top of the Amud. We're going to be starting at the 2 dots with the Braisa. Now, continuing with the Klal Acher that the Mishnah said in Halacha Aleph, the Braisa says, this is Gavaldik, that any product, Kol shet chilosai oichel, as the Gemara will give examples for this brayso. If something in its initial stages is edible, but if you leave it in the ground, which there would be a reason for that, but for a prolonged amount of time, ve'ein soifai oichel, at some point it's no longer edible. So as the Tosefta, as we'll read in the Rashirilio, words out the halacha of the brayso, chayiv b'tchilosai upater b'soifai, which means that only if that item was detached earlier while it's oichel, only then will the owner be chayiv to separate the maises. And if a person left it in the ground to the point where now when you detached it, it's no longer oichel, then you're going to be exempt. And we're going to have more up until the Mishnah about intention. Intention on one hand is very critical. On the other hand, there will be times that one's intention will be batla daitoi eitzel kol adam, which means that if I am intending, I'm planting something, or I'm leaving a quantity of something for a purpose that theoretically should have exempted it from maisris, but if what I am doing is very unusual, there will be times that my intention will not affect the halacha, and being that this item, for most people, are left in the ground, as we'll see, for a shorter amount of time, and therefore it's normally harvested while it's eichel, even though I didn't do it, as we will see, my intention will be ineffective. Okay, that will be more or less the topic all the way up until the Mishnah. And in Halacha Beis, the second Halacha, the second Mishnah of this Perek, will give continuity to what we learned in the first Mishnah, and let us use the term of Oinas HaMaisris. Oinas HaMaisris again means that there is a certain stage prior to which, if someone for whatever reason harvested that product prior to the point where they are considered food, even if one would have left it in the ground, it would have developed into food. This is the opposite of the case that will start out today. Not kol shet chilosai oichel ve'ein soifai oichel. Pum fakert. Something that shet chilosai is not oichel. If it was harvested at that point, you won't be chayiv in maisres. Only if you leave it in the ground enough time will you be chayiv. And it's really going to be a fascinating Mishnah and subsequent Gemara. The Mishnah will detail many different types of fruits, and the Mishnah will give us its oinas hamaisres. How are we detect whether it's halachically considered food or not? And interestingly, as we're going to find out so much information about fruits, just as a rule for people here in LA that have fruit trees, that you should know that detached fruits ripen quicker than their counterpart left on the tree. There are certain fruits, like take an avocado, you leave them on a tree, they're not going to fully ripen. Part of the process is for them to be detached, and only then do they ripen. And I know many people that are botanists will be able to give many, many more examples, but this is a rule that Chazal give, this concept that detached fruits ripen quicker, and that will be used to determine whether a certain fruit reached its oinas hamaisris or not. So b'kitzur, we're going to have a lot of fascinating information about fruits. And at the end of today's daf, on Daf Gimel Amud Beis, the Gemara is going to make a correlation, a parallel between Hilchas Maisris, when is something considered food, when is it not considered food, and Hilchei Shabbos. And as we will see, we're going to touch on many halachas today. We're going to touch on Hilchas Muksa a little bit. We're going to touch upon the heter, when you have a geraf shel re'i, that even though Muksa is usher to be moved, when a person has in their home what one considers to be waste, garbage, even though theoretically it should be muksa, for kavod habriyos, we are allowed to move it. But there are other reasons why, if someone would have certain seeds spread out on the floor in one's home, sometimes one will not be allowed to sweep it up or to gather it. We're going to speak about a Tosfos and Beitza, about the Ma'amer, When is there an isur of gathering? When is there no isur of ma'amir? We're going to speak about the boina, maybe charisha, marasayin, a lot. But the root will be that when it comes to Hilchas Shabbos, we also need to determine whether that seed that you want to gather off the ground, whether it's considered oichel or whether it's not considered oichel, as we are analyzing here in Hilchas Maisis. We'll leave it at that. And Chavra, let us start inside again. Dav Gimel Amud Aleph. Right, 4 lines from the top of the Amud by the 2 dots, beginning with the Brais. So normally the rule is, and as we already gave the intro for Halacha Beis, that when you plant something, it begins, especially most of the fruits of trees, it doesn't begin as oichel. And at some point, as it develops on the tree or in the ground, by grain, after it reaches a third, now it's considered oichel. That's the rule. Now, there are certain items that go in the opposite direction, and that is what this Braisa is talking about. That kol shetchilosei oichel, says the Braisa, something that is planted, that is developing, and in its earlier stages, it's considered something edible. But ve'ein soifei oichel, but if it's left in the ground for an additional amount of time, it becomes hard like wood. It becomes inedible. Now here, our girsa in the Gemara quoting the Braisa, we don't say the halacha, even though we can imagine it, but let us read the Rashirilio, the first Rashirilio in the Amid, right, top right. So he continues quoting the Nusach of the Tosefta, that there, the Chayiv, I'm reading inside the Rashirilio, excuse me, the Chayiv b'tchilasei, upater b'soifei, which means only if it's detached off the ground, off the tree, while it's oichel, only then are you chayiv b'maisvis. But if you leave it in the ground to the point where halachically, objectively, it's no longer considered edible, then even though you intend to eat it, then it won't be considered food, and it's going to be completely exempted from maisvis. Now, the Braisa and the Tosefta did not give an example, and that's what the Gemara is going to do. So says the Gemara, my islach, amazing way of the Yerushalmi's formulation. Give me an example. It's like a question. Okay, give me an example of something. Normally it doesn't work that way. You plant something in the beginning, it's nothing. Then it develops into food. What is food? And then it turns into non-food. We're not finding a Metzias, we're finding another part of Torah we taught in the Brais. And the Brais is speaking about a certain type of grass that's called echroya. And the grass at some point develops seeds inside of it. I don't know what the chroya is in English. So Kevan, you won't be able to show us a picture, but the concept we get. And what's amazing is that the seed only begins to develop after the grass becomes hard like wood, prior to which the grass is edible. So that's, first of all, that's a phenomenon, a certain unique type of grass. Now, people do at times plant some of this echroya grass for its seed, but what's very unusual is for someone to plant a large amount of echroya only for its seed. That's something that's normally not done. So aside of the Gemara just giving an answer, that what are we talking about? We're talking about this echroya grass. We're already going to learn another Gevaldeke Yisoid, and I know I get excited about it, and that's really how we finished yesterday's class. Intention is important, but in some areas we say Batla Daitoi Eitzel Koladom, and we really have to learn a lot to know when to say what. Okay, so let's go inside. So says the Braisa, Hamakayim Mileya Shel Echroya Lezera. If someone does something very unusual, which is that they have an entire bed, an entire patch, I don't know how big it has to be, but an entire patch of echroya, all of it was only for its seed. In other words, the person is doing something extremely unusual. So what the Braisa is really going to be saying with this is that, as we will see, that, Batladaita, his intention is insignificant. Now, how do we apply that? That's important. And therefore what? Therefore what the Gemara is going to say in a moment. But hold your thought. On the other hand, Batladaita, it says the Brais. But if a person is planting a few stalks of echroya, and they're only planting it for its seed, which means that they plan to leave it in the ground up until the point where it develops seed, which means that the grass itself will become inedible, it will become hard like wood. Since this is the usual, loy batla daitoi. Loy batla daitoi. Now, when you finish learning this brayso, one can make a huge mistake. What could be the mistake? Oh, that in the case where you left an entire milea, an entire bed of achroya for its seed, okay, we get it. It's something very unusual. And therefore what? And therefore, even if I taka left it in the ground and I only harvested the grass once it became hard like wood, is the Braisa saying I'll be chayiv to separate maisris? That cannot be. Because if the reality is that when I harvested something, it's inedible, even though most people wouldn't have left it that long in the ground in that amount. Doesn't matter. Something that's not oichel, when it's harvested, will never be chayiv in maisris. That's what the Gemara's point wants to be. So l'may nafkamina, if yeh batla daitoi or ain batla daitoi, what's the difference? So Rabbi Yoina explains. So Rabbi Yoina, let me tell you how we apply the rule of the Braisa in conjunction with the rule in the Mishnah, in conjunction with the Braisa that we started today with. Kol shetchilasa oichel ve'ein soifa oichel. That for who shall likate yarak. We're speaking about a guy that did something very unusual. He wants to maintain the entire bed of this achraya only for its seed. What were to happen if he or someone else accidentally harvested the grass prior to it becoming hard? And what did we learn yesterday? This is important, just to remind ourselves, that if something was planted only for its seed, that item will not be chayv in maises. So you would think that this guy who planted this milea of echroya, since his intention was only lizera, even if it was harvested while it's oichel, it should still remain exempt. This is what we have the second braisa teaching you, batla daitoi, that since in reality, when the grass was harvested, if it was harvested prematurely for this guy, in other words, it was still soft, it didn't have seed yet, the grass itself was soft, the grass was edible, in such a case, you will be chayiv. The person planted it lizera, and we learned yesterday when you plant something not for oichel, if your intention is lizera, you're exempt. Batla daitoi. Aval loy likate yarak. However, even though batla daitoi, if the person actually fulfilled what his intention was, he planted an entire bed of achraya lizera, and he left it in the ground until it produced zera. That means that when you harvested it, the grass was hardened. Then no one will say that since batla daitoi, you're going to be chayiv. That doesn't make sense. Beautiful. So the way the Gemara words it, would anyone say that? Of course not. We don't say batla daitoi to go against a reality. We do say batla daitoi to nullify your intention. So you have to look at the reality and you have to look at your intention. You put them both together, it's gavaldik. And by the way, the same thing is in the opposite. In other words, if a person planted the kolachim yechidim, the second case of the second brayso that we learned today, since you planted it for its seed, even if it was harvested early, even if it was harvested when the grass is, yes, edible, you harvested it when it was tchilasei oichel, here we will say you will still be exempt. Why will you be exempt? Because you had in mind lizera, and which is the normal. This is important. Okay. And now we're going to quote the final part of the Mishnah of Halacha Aleph. V'chol she'ein tchilasei oichel, which is the norm, which is really the premise that will segment, that will segue into Halacha Beis. That if something is planted and in its earlier stages of development, it's not considered halachically edible. It's not considered food, which would mean that if it was harvested early for whatever reason, you'll be exempt from ISIS. But at some point in its development, now it becomes oichel. If it was harvested early, it will remain exempt, even rabbinically. But if it's harvested, and I'm going to use the words from oinas hamaisres, then yes, it will be included in the obligation of hiding. So says the Gemara here again, my islach. Give me an example, which is interesting. That's the norm. You want an example? Says the Gemara, just look at the next Mishnah. The reason why the Mishnah, that's the opening line in Halacha Beis. We're going to learn it in the next line. Why do we have such a question? Clearly, because if one detached fruits prior to the stages that the Mishnah will elaborate thereof, then the person won't be chayiv even if you intend to eat it. It's subjectively not considered food. And the first example the Mishnah will speak about will be about figs. Te'enim, mishe yavchilu, stam lohoid. Why does the Mishnah begin with figs? Maybe because the eitz hadas, right? You have 4 opinions in Chazal. According to some, it was a fig tree. I don't know, the first tree. The kid said, that's segmenting into the next Mishnah. So says the Holy Mishnah, how do you know that it reached its oinas hamaisres? And wow, look how many different types of fruits will the Mishnah enumerate. So enim, when it comes to figs, mished bichelu, and chevra, let us wait until the Gemara for us to know the meaning of the word bichelu and how it's applied to figs. So remember, bichelu, ha'anovim, when it comes to grapes, the ha'bu'ushim is a certain type of inferior sour grape. So it's grape and grape. So here the words of Chazal is mishehiv ishu and hivishu from busha. And we will see in the Gemara that the bu'usha phase of grapes is exactly the same as the bichelu phase of the figs. It's just like in the Holy Tongue when it comes to harvesting, we don't use the same word for all of the products, right? We use the word ketzira when it comes to grains. And then for many different types of fruits, we have different words for the same harvest. Here also, when it comes to determining or defining a certain phase in its development, just to remember that bu'usha and bichelu is the same. It just depends if you're speaking about figs, if you're speaking about grapes, and all of this we will leave for the Gemara. Oig, sumac, tusim are mulberries. So there is misheya adimu, and as we will see that these are fruits that in their inception, their color is green. And at some point in their maturing on the trees, they begin to turn red. And that's the meaning misheya adimu. It's not until it's fully red, but if someone harvested it when it was green, then it's not considered doichel. Once this fruit began to turn red, that's a sign that it became food, and you're chayiv in maises. And now the Mishnah continues, even though we began with oig and tusim, but this rule, this siman, applies v'chol ha'adumim. All fruits that are red when they are mature, when they are ripe, and they begin green, you have to just add those words in. So that will be a siman for all of them. That all of the fruits that are red fruits, when you harvest them, when do they become oichel? Mishayadim, when they start to turn from green into red. Very good. Now, I just want to say something interesting, that a pomegranate is a reddish fruit. And I think that's the hemshech of the Mishnah. So even though the Mishnah is giving you a klal, v'chol ha'adumim, but it's a klal that has exceptions. Because the pomegranate, now I don't know if the pomegranate begins green. I don't know that. But a pomegranate has its own siman. When is it considered oichel? Misheyi masu. Now the Gemara will give 2 understandings of the words yimasu. One of them is from when it becomes soft, and we'll leave the other one. We'll leave the other one when we get into the Mishnah. Returning to Daf Gimel Amud Beis. Next sets of fruits. Hatamar, dates, mishayotilu sa'oir. Dates swell like sourdough. You have to push it, see it. You have to be a country boy. When it begins, and the Gemara will elaborate on this more. When it begins to swell up, from then on it's considered doichel. Haparsikin, peaches, mishayotilu gidim. When they develop sinews. Again, the Gemara will elaborate as to what's the siman of developing sinews. Hagoizim, walnuts, mishayasu meguru, when they become like a storeroom. It's interesting that in the initial phases of the development of a walnut, the nut sticks, is stuck to the inner shell. And at some point, when it's maturing, the brain, the meat, whatever, the nut separates itself from the inner part of the shell. Once that begins to happen, then we view the nut to be living inside a storeroom, just like inside a storeroom, right? The items are not stuck on the walls. Right, in Hasidus, you have the makiv hakorev and the makiv harachik. A makiv hakorev is clothing. The clothing is custom made for you. My clothing won't fit on you. But a makiv harachik, which is a room, a home, I don't fit in the home the way I fit into my clothing. Many different sizes of people can equally fit into the same room, and it's all because of that the outer makiv is not touching. It's far away from me. In other words, from when the walnut, when the klipa goes from being a makiv hakorev to a makiv harachik. In the words of the Mishnah, from when they become like a storeroom. Bottom line is from when the nut is detached from the klipa. That is the Tanakama. And on here, Rabbi Yehuda argues. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, no, that goizim, and he joins together with the goizim, shkedim, mishiyasu klipa. From when they form a skin. Forming a skin is not what you think. Again, we're going to leave that. We're going to leave that for the Gemara. Amazing. Instead of from when they become detached from the klipa, from the outer klipa, is from when they develop a klipa. When they begin to form a certain skin around the nut, as we'll see in the Gemara. Next item, hacharuvim, carobs, mishe yankidu, from when they become spotted. And this rule of spotting, like we had in the beginning of the Mishnah, that red fruits that begin green, from when they turn red, the spotting isn't only for carobs, but the Mishnah continues, v'chol hashchorim, all dark-colored fruits, not black. Dark-colored fruits have the same siman that from when they become mishayankidu, from when they become spotted. Kevin, you don't need pictures now because the Gemara will elaborate on each one. From when they become spotted, that's a sign that they reach that level of maturity. Oh, that now they're considered doichel. Now, even though people would still leave it attached for a longer period, but if they were detached from that point onwards, then you're gonna that they reach the oinus hamaisres. So then you can tithe it right away, or when it reaches its gemar malacha, then you'll be chayiv to tithe it, as we will apply all of the laws of maisres. Next category, and the Mishnah joins together. Hagosim are pears. Hakerus malin are small apples, certain type of apple. And perishim, let's leave perishim as for the Gemara to identify with the different opinions. The hachazranim are wild apples. That these items become oichel, mishe yakrichu, from when they become bald. Guys, becoming bald is a sign of maturity. And the balding is that many fruits, when they're younger, they have a fuzz. We're going to call that fuzz hair. And the fuzz falls off. The falling, when they're balding, is a sign that they are maturing. And this siman, like we already know, it's going to be the third time, isn't only for the group of fruits that were mentioned, but we apply to all of the light-colored fruits. So we have dark-colored fruits from when they become speckled, spotted, and the light-colored fruits, the chol halavanim, mishayakrichu, from when they become bald from their fuzz. Further, hatilson, fenugreek. Clearly, our Mishnah is of the opinion that fenugreek has to be tithed. So, from when are you chayiv to tithe it? When does it become oichel? Mishatitzmach, from when it sprouts. Now, we are speaking already about many items, like unlike fruits grow off a tree. But when it comes to vegetables, by the way, vegetables will be the next Mishnah, but let's call this legumes or different herbs that they grow in the ground. And some of them completely grow on the ground. Some of them begin in the ground, and at some point they begin to sprout out. So that will be a sign that the tilson, when it begins to sprout, now it's already considered daichel. And the final, amazing, the Mishnah puts together all of the grains and olives. That hatfua v'hazeisim, because we had grapes in the beginning of the Mishnah. From when they grow till a third, meaning a third of their full size. And we did have a mention in the Masechta Trumos, I forgot on what daf, that the third of its size, don't measure that with the amount of time it needs to stay on the tree. Because from a fruit to go from 0 to third takes a lot more time than for that item to go from a third to its full size. But we're speaking about people who know these products, and they know when they are normally harvested. So when this item reaches a third of its full size, that is the siman that it reached the level of eichel. And I just want to mention, and we're going to repeat this on occasion, that there was a big machlokes rishonim, the Rosh and the Tosfos in various places hold that really all of the items in the Mishnah share one siman, a third. Just it's very hard to determine the third. So up until the Tfuah and the Zeisim, Chazal had a Mesoira of a certain external sign that you know is easy, right? I can see when it gets spotted, when it begins to turn red. Even we can read the Mishnah, we can get it. So how do I know a third? They gave a siman. When it came to Tfuah and Zeisim and all others, you don't have a siman, so you go back to the rule that applies to everything, which is the shlish. I'm going from memory. I don't have Svarim with where I'm at right now. I think that Rambam makes mention to when this item, its seed has enough potency that if you were to harvest it now, it can be replanted. And I think that's connected to the shlish. The Rambam gives that siman. But anyways, the Rosh and Tosfos say that there was one klal for everything, shlish. And whenever Chazal gave a sign, that's a siman to know that it reached the shlish. The Ritva and many other Rishonim say absolutely not. They say no. If Rabbeinu Hakadosh, if the shear would have been the shlish, then Rebbe would have said it for everything, mish shlish, and then Rebbe would have said, how do you know it reached the shlish? He would have given you the sign. So he actually holds that only by Tfuah and Zeisim do we use the shear of a third of its full size of the shlish, and every single other item mentioned in the Mishnah has its own shear, not connected to a shlish. Just to be aware of that. I don't appreciate this machlekes enough because I don't know the Metzias. And I don't think their argument is going to be so far one off the other. In other words, in order for the Rosh and the Tosfos to say that when these red fruits begin to turn red, it's got to be more or less a third. They're not. The only thing is, it's not exactly. Okay, let's leave it at that. Just
Rabbi, isn't it strange that Tilson is in this mix, which is not a shlish thing, and it seems like a vegetable, and it's about when it sprouts.
First of all, it's not a vegetable. It's not considered a vegetable because I know that the next Mishnah will speak about vegetables. So we're going to have a whole Mishnah about vegetables. It's considered, let's call it a legume. Especially since we began, I think it was on Daf Aleph, and we had all of the braisas about what are the sources. So what we learned in the words in the braisa is, according to the way we are learning the Gemara Kipshutai, that everything is chayv d'oraisa, and vegetables are only chayv midrabanan. So yeah, Danny, Tilson is not. And then we also just learned about the Rabbi Gamliel. We just learned about the Sfenu Greek. Okay, let's leave it at that. Now let's begin. The Mishnah began, Hate'enim, that was the first item that the Mishnah spoke about. The Hate'enim are figs. That what's the cutting point? What's the critical point? Not cutting, because it only begins. What's the critical point for the Hate'enim? Misha bichelu, bichels. So what's bichelo? Bichelo, what is that? So Rabbi Bar Amar choisa. Now I know that our other girsois, but the word choisa means ripe. In other words, it has to be ripe. That's the siman that you get. Now, where do we find that word bichelo in reference to ripe? And by the way, ripening. I like what you're doing. Ripening clearly from the pasuk has to do with size. So again, there's a certain size. Now that I reached that size, now it's ripe enough. And we find this is a pasuk in Zechariah. The context is a negative context, but the words in the pasuk is "V'gam nafsham bochalo bi." This is about Hashem speaking about how they became repulsive to Him. In other words, their sinfulness became larger, became bigger, and the word is bochalo. So bochalo has to do with growing large, really. Bachalo in this verse, even though it means they became repulsive, it became because they became too big. Like Rishon is a rule that we have that there's a certain amount of tolerance that Hashem has, even for sinful behavior. When you do it once, He overlooks it. You do it once, He overlooks it. When you the third time, remember all these midrashim that we learned, then he adds them all up together. Then it becomes a problem. But their sinfulness became matured, or it grew large. Anyways, that's where we found up one pasuk in the whole Tanakh It's interesting why we use those words when it comes to a fig. And again, just a maybe. Al pi drush, since one of the four chazals regarding the Eitz Hadas is it was a fig, and we sinned with the fig, so we use a pasuk in Zajac that's speaking about something that's repulsive to Hashem, which is our misbehavior, and we use that lashon when it comes to a fig, maybe. Weiter. Now, Rab Abba Bar Yaakov Mishem Rabbi Yochanan, he says, it's even if he doesn't disagree that the Mishnah uses the words bichelu. Bichelu is too vague. In other words, Rebbe is trying to get like all of the other samanim are great and get spotted when the fuzz falls off. It's gavaldik. That means that people like us, you learn the Mishnah and you know when you tell a person, figs when it becomes ripe. I don't know when that is. We're not talking about when it's fully matured. For that we don't need a Mishnah. So he gives a siman. And what's a siman? Nishiyadimu PM. The mouth of the fig, this is important, is referring to the part of the fig that's attached to the tree. Now I know that someone over here is trying to show you many pictures of figs and green and red. I don't know to make a comment on that. It could be certain figs always remain green. I don't know if it means from green to red. I'll tell you why I was thinking about that yesterday, because the Mishnah gives a siman for all of the red fruits that their sign of maturity is when they start turning red. So it doesn't make sense that if te'enim would be included in that, then we wouldn't specify te'enim in a different clause.
But figs are not red. That picture that he showed shows there's a little reddishness just at the end.
That's
good. A fig is really black if you see the color of a ripe fig. So I think it fits.
Very good. Okay, I'm happy with that. In other words, the way I understand the Gemara is that bichalu, it's nice that the Rebbe chose to use a lashon of Tanakh, but it's so vague. If bichalu means large or if it means ripe, it's not enough of a siman. So the Gemara gave a siman. The mouth means the part of the fig that's connected to the tree from when that turns red or when it begins. Reddening means it's beginning to turn red. Gavaldi. That is the siman that it reached the phase of oichel or it hit oinas hamaisras. Frek the Gemara, the Gemara is asking on the Gemara. B'shem Rabbi Yochanan, you're trying to help me. Problem is you're not helping me. It's not true. No, it's you're giving me a siman that's not uniform. And by the way, it could be, the Gemara could have answered, well, at least for the ones that turn red, that will be the siman. But anyways, so Rab Tancham Bamerion b'shem, the same Rabbi Yochanan, he says that lekeyach, this is what you do. Lekeyach achas umaniach, if you have a fig tree, if you were to take one fig off the tree and what? And just set it aside for 24 hours, in bashla b'toich kedei meis le'eis, if within 24 hours, up until 24 hours, it becomes edible, it becomes ripe enough to be eaten, then that's a sign that all of the figs on the tree already reached oinas hamaisis. And therefore, if one would now to harvest all of the figs of that tree, all of them will be chayiv. All of them will be, you don't have to wait for every single fig to the me'es le'es. And by the way, if you remember, we already learned in Peyam, Mesechtas Peyam, right? Likitoson ka'achas. Likitoson ka'achas is one of the 5 criteria needed for something to be chayiv and peyah, that figs are excluded, because normally when you harvest figs, you do not harvest even on the same tree all the figs together. And a chanami. But if someone were to harvest all of the figs of the tree at the same time, so if one of them turns within 24 hours to the point, as we mentioned in the words of intro, that when you detach a fruit off the tree, it will ripen quicker. Amazing. It will ripen quicker. When it stays on the tree, it might grow, but it doesn't mean it's going to become riper. If it becomes ripe, then the whole tree already reached oinas hamaisis. Now that's a huge statement. Again, chiddush is even though figs are normally not harvested at the same time. So the Gemara gave, and this siman is true even for the types of figs that don't become red at their mouths. So you see that the Gemara was quoting B'Shem Rabbi Yochanan once, B'Shem Rabbi Yochanan from another Amayda, all trying to give you a practical siman to know regarding figs, because Bichelu was not sufficient for practical application. Then the Mishnah goes on. Ha'anavim And we said the word avashin are grapes. It's just an inferior, sour variety of grapes. That from when do we know that those grapes reached oinas hamaisris? From when it becomes misha yav ishu. And as we mentioned, yav ishu for grapes is the same as what's this yav ishu? What's beusha? So Rabbi Ze'eda b'shem Rabbi Yasa misha yikaru be'isha. Now the word be'isha means spoiled, which is amazing. And when we're speaking about spoiled, just to have a rule when it comes to grapes, I wish Gabrielle was here, that even good quality grapes, certainly inferior quality grapes, they mamish deteriorate if they are left on the tree too long, or on the vine, however you'll call it. Maybe that's a truth when it comes to older fruits, I don't know, but it's certainly pronounced by grapes. So unlike, this is important, unlike other items mentioned in the Mishnah, let's go with the Rosh and the Tosfos, that when it reaches a third, that's already considered doichel. Yavishu, according to Rab Ze'eda, this is important, it means only from when it begins to spoil. That means that grapes should be left on the tree, on the vine. And if you harvest it prematurely, the way it sounds like, you're not going to be chayiv to be ma'asid. When does it reach the oinas hamaisris? From now, you should not leave it on the vine. Now it's going to begin to deteriorate. If this pshat is correct, it's going to be a big kasha on the Rosh and the Tosfos. This is going to be a big proof to the Ritva. Because to me, it doesn't sound like all the other simanim, that its fruit becomes at least oichel at a much earlier stage, if this is the right pshat in the Gemara. Now, again, the Mishnah gives you a
it doesn't match up with the third.
Doesn't match up with the third at all, Danny.
Uh-huh.
Now I know that every noise kalim, there's a big machlokes. I want you to know what you're talking about. You're telling me that a grape, when it reaches a third, from then on it begins to spoil? Of course not. When you leave it too long on the vine, then it begins to spoil. I understand grapes needing to be on the tree, the max. And just for the record, that grapes, right, is another one of the four chazals of the Eitz Hadas. Pashut b'Metzias, what it was. And as we had before by the Te'enim, that Gemara, the Amoraim, gave more physical simanim to know how to apply the rule of the Mishnah. Here we have the same thing by the grapes. No, Be'isha was not sufficient. For me, it would not be sufficient. It's not about speckled. It's not about reddening. It's not about how do you apply that. So says the Gemara, Rab Aibu Banagri and Rab Tanchum Bari Loi b'Shem Rab Nachum Bar Simoim. The simon I heard from the Rebbe. For who shetehei chartzano shalahem nines mebachutz. And I'm going to quote, I heard this, that the only fruit that it's klipa snoiga begashmius. In other words, we learn in Chassidus that you have the shalish klipa hatameis legamri, and then there's something called klipa snoiga. Very vague words. In other words, the goal would be, the ideal would be for godliness to be revealed, for us to be able to see the truth, for us to be able to see through the outer shell. But klipa, like by the walnut, completely obstructs our ability to see what's inside of it. That's the meaning of klipa. In nature, the items that grow with an outer shell, there is one, the grape, that think about it, that the skin, in English, it's not even called, it's called skin. Not because it's soft, because it's transparent. It's called noiga. You can see through it. Now, when the grape begins to develop, it's not transparent. But as it begins to fill with water, the outer skin begins to stretch. And at some point, you, standing outside of it, can see through the skin, but not you can see through a millimeter. You can see into the meat. You can see all the way into the seed. That's the expression. That the chartzon, we're going to go with the word chartzon, means the seed, can be seen even though you are outside of it. That means that the outer skin becomes completely noigad, translucent, almost transparent. Fascinating. Now, I want you to know that if the grape stays on the vine longer or too long, it becomes even darker. And by the way, many times when you're going to buy a grape in the market, you won't be able to see all the way through it. and a chanami, because you left it. Now I'm going to go to the Rosh and to the Tosfos, because when you leave it, let's go that this siman is only a third, more or less a third. When you leave it longer, then it develops to the point that you can no longer see the seed. But when it goes from being non-oichel to oichel, when grapes begin to develop, there is this phase where mitamol, the klipa becomes transparent or translucent. And that's why the Jewish people are compared, to grapes. When people do shidduchim, we use that expression, invei hagefen, be'invei hagefen. Which is, there's klipa. Olam Haza is one big klipa. But what we aspire, at least, is for us to live a type of life that one is able to see through the klipa. And that's a sign that you are a grape. A beautiful. Okay, so bottom line is that you have products that are halachically considered doichel, and then you have these food items that are not considered doichel. And how relevant that is, from my side, it's a simple rule. Only when it's oichel, when it's harvested as oichel, are you going to be chayiv to tithe it? And that same item, if it's harvested not as oichel, either you harvested it too early, that's the halacha base, or the beginning of today's daf, or it's that echroya grass. You should have, if you would have harvested it earlier, you would have bin chayiv. Now that you left it on the ground, it became hard like wood. Objectively speaking, now you're not chayiv. So you should know that by Hilchas Shabbos, there's a huge consequence regarding the definition of an item, whether it's halach called food or not. Where do we find that? So it's time for us to know that, we know from the Bavli that Rabbi Yochanan had 10 sons, who, Rachmana litzlan, all of his 10 sons, 10 of his sons passed away b'chayav. That means Rabbi Yochanan was a person, he was the redactor of Talmud Yerushalmi, but in his personal life, it almost sounds like he was like Eov. He suffered tremendously. Now, another thing to know about his infancy and youth, that when Rabbi Yochanan's mother was pregnant with him, his father passed away. And by the way, this is going to be connected to the words that I'm going to speak Shabbos about the siyum of Masechtas Truma, about Reb Nisa. So Rabbi Yochanan Bechlal did not meet his father, and worse, his mother passed away while she was in childbirth, like Binyamin. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan did not have, not a tate, not a mama. He was raised by his grandparents, by his Zayda and his Baba. Just as an intro to what we're saying. And when he was very, very young, his grandfather would carry him, putting him on his shoulders. What's amazing is that Rabbi Yochanan had recollections of Torah that he heard while he was riding on his grandfather's shoulders. Amazing. And I'm sure there's some inner meaning in that as well, but let's read the words. That while I was riding on my grandfather's shoulders, which means when I was that age, and even when I was on his shoulders, there was a time that I heard, don't forget that Rabbi Yochanan was from the first era of the Amoraim. So he learned as a child by the Tanoim. And I heard the voice. So he remembered a Torah that was sitting and Masnean teaching the following. We have 2 minutes. That on Shabbos, we're speaking about if someone has on the floor of their home, they used to have earthen floors. If you have me'ein, means seeds. I know it literally means the insides, but we're talking about the pits or the seeds. That if you have the pits of cantaloupe halachically are considered oichel. You are allowed to gather them by sweeping them up. But but you're not allowed to sweep up seeds of the watermelon. If you remember, prior to all of the genetic engineering, there used to be seeds in a watermelon. I want to add another very important. I think we spoke this out once a while back. That nishtanu hativim. There's no doubt that nowadays seeds of watermelon is edible. I want you to know that, consequential.
It has been for Sephardim for 1,000 years.
Very good. That's very important, Kevin. That's why, just to know that these statements must have been, now with the chal, there's no seeds. And the time when these statements were made, seeds of watermelon were not edible. Something changed. Everyone talks about that. Now, I want to say a couple of steps. First of all, seeds. and the shells of food items generally fall into the category of muktzah, which rabbinically may not be moved. However, when it comes to muktzah, waste that's accumulated in one's home, there is a blank heter called garaf shel re'i, which means a pile of excrement, which means garbage. That garbage or any type of movement that you want to make on Shabbos and on Yom Tov to remove from your home, garbage is allowed because a human being has to live in a clean environment. So that's number one. So the muktzah issue was a non-issue. What is the issue? Remember, sweeping a earth floor, not my floor in the house. Sweeping an earth floor is asur. Why? Because you might level out the floor. There might be a protrusion, there might be an indentation, and leveling out the earth is asur mitzad boina. Okay? And even if the earth is mamish flat, we would say marasayin, don't do it because it looks like. There is a maras ayin issue only. And therefore, that's going to be the bottom line. If the item that you're cleaning is in itself edible, so the observer, whatever your intention is, even if your intention is just to clean the environment, which you're allowed to do, no one will think you're doing boiner. They're going to think you're gathering the seeds, a cantaloupe, to eat it because it's edible. But if you have the seeds of watermelon all over the floor, since these seeds are inedible, no one will say, you're doing it to eat. Now, maybe because the seeds are very little. I don't know. Wouldn't work that way. When it's not food, then we have to be chayish. It looks like boina. So it's gavaldik. So whether you could sweep up certain items off your ground or not has to do whether it's oichel or not oichel. And that's why the Gemara brings it over here, that the concept of oichel or not isn't only a maisres issue, it's also very much connected to Hilchos Shabbos. We'll stop over here and God willing tomorrow to be continued in person.
The irony is that no one eats cantaloupe seeds. And
that's amazing.
Watermelon seeds.
Saying that
it's literally like that.
It went to the opposite. But I think watermelon seeds have to be dried out first. That's what someone told me. When they're wet, no one eats them.
We eat both. Dried out, seasoned.
Mamish. Okay, no, it's a cultural thing. 100%.
Probably healthy.
It could be just a snack. Snack doesn't.
Something to chew on. Exactly. Something to chew on.
Something to chew on. Maybe that alone. I don't know if it has to be if I remember correctly, whether something is nutrition or not, it's connected to Hilchas Eruvin. If you leave an Eruv of food, it has to be something that's that has nutritional value. I don't know if for oichel you have to have nutritional value. Many things we eat today is mamish poison. we eat it because you want to have something sweet.
In the halachas of Birchas Hanenin, there's a whole discussion about that. Like if you eat something that's spoiled or whatever.
Very good. Olive oil in the times of the Mishnah, you would not have made it eggs because it's mazik. Clear. By the way, nowadays you can argue that having a teaspoon of olive oil, when you're having olive oil that comes from the same country and it's fresh, it's very healthy. That's what they say.
Daily. Yeah.
And it tastes good.